For the first time since the United Nations was born, there is a full-fledged war in the center of Europe.
Ukraine and Russia square off at the United Nations as representatives from both countries meet in Belarus in an attempt to pause the conflict. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. There were a number of new developments as the Ukraine crisis enters its sixth day. As fighting intensified, a top advisor to Ukraine's president says the first round of talks with Russia has ended, but more talks could happen soon. Meanwhile, discussions on Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union seem to be gaining steam, while Western economic and diplomatic pressure continues to mount on Russia. And the United Nations says more than 500,000 Ukrainians have now fled the country, while warning the exodus could reach 4 million people. For more on today's UN meetings, we turn to Sarah Walton. She's in New York. Sarah, the UN General Assembly met in a rare emergency session today. Talk to us about what was accomplished.
Well, very little concrete so far, because actually they've just finished the session for the day and they haven't got through the list of speakers yet. More than 100 member states expected to have addressed the meeting by the time it comes to a close, so they're going to have to continue at some point. But the meeting in itself is significant because it is so rare. Just the 11th time the General Assembly has been called to meet in this fashion, and it was very emotive. We heard from the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations who read out and showed the General Assembly what he said was a series of text messages from a young Russian soldier to his mother shortly before that soldier was killed. And in those messages, he said that the Russian soldier said he was afraid and that he had been wrongly led to believe that Russian forces like him would be welcomed in Ukraine. Now, the Russian ambassador to the UN responded to that, saying those messages were part of a fake propaganda campaign. And he defended Russia's actions, saying that they were protecting civilians from Ukrainian aggression in the Donbass region. Now, we are expecting the members of the General Assembly to take a vote on a resolution on this situation in the coming days once the meeting has come to a close. Now, that resolution would be non-binding, so it's not going to force anyone to take any action, but it does carry political weight, because the General Assembly is the only body of the United Nations where all 193 member states sit equally. Nobody has veto power, nobody has more power than the others, and so it would be really the clearest gauge so far of world opinion on Russia's actions in the Ukraine.
And the Security Council met in the afternoon. What do we learn about the ongoing humanitarian crisis?
Yeah, that's right. The fifth time in the last week that the Security Council has got together to discuss the situation in Ukraine. As you say, this time they were looking specifically at the humanitarian situation. The meeting began with a briefing from Martin Griffiths, who's the emergency relief coordinator for the United Nations. Now, he warned that the UN is yet to receive adequate assurance from either party involved in the fighting that UN aid workers on the ground will be kept safe. The UN's actually due to launch a flash appeal on Tuesday to start raising money to support these aid operations. We also heard from the head of the UN Refugee Agency, who said that more than 500,000 people have fled Ukraine so far, but they are preparing for that number to rise to 4 million in the coming days. This is going to be a huge operation. Now, we are also expecting that the members of the Security Council may take a vote on a resolution following this meeting, the draft of which calls for an end to hostilities, for civilians to be protected, and for humanitarian workers to be given safe access. Now, humanitarian issues are often an area where members of the Security Council are more likely to find common ground. But you have to remember that Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has the right to veto decisions and resolutions made by the Security Council. And it has already exercised that right in recent days, using it on Friday to block a resolution that criticised its actions in Ukraine. Today's meeting was just as tense and controversial as the other meetings we've seen in recent days, and analysts fully expect that Russia would use that veto power again should the Security Council pass a resolution on this issue.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Sarah Walton reporting from the United Nations in New York for us. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Klaus Larres is a history and international affairs professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Anton Fedyashin is a Russian affairs analyst and history professor at American University. And Sergiy Kudelia is a Ukrainian researcher in Switzerland, fellow at the University of Basel, and that's where we're going to start. Sergiy, there's a lot to talk about outside of Ukraine, but also inside Ukraine. You've been tweeting about what's going on in the country. Earlier today, you had a tweet about a town in southeastern Ukraine, I believe, where the city council building, I should say, was encircled by Russian troops. But in front of them were a number of citizens chanting, "Get out of the country." And you mentioned that it may be easy to capture the cities, but governing is going to be another story. Can you give us an idea of the landscape? But what are we seeing? There's still a stiff resistance to Russian forces in many parts of the country, correct?
Absolutely. So the thrust of the Russian attack is now on two major cities, two largest cities in Ukraine, the capital, Kyiv, and Kharkiv. We've seen the use of ballistic missiles against these cities. Ukrainians estimate that over 100 ballistic missiles have been used by the Russians against the cities over the last 4 days. But we also seen a very strong pushback coming from within these cities. So the territorial defense units, these are basically recruitment groups that rely on local volunteers, have significant demand. There is a significant number of people who are signing up to participate in these units. And there is general mobilization of the locals within all of the cities in Ukraine, preparing to withstand the Russian assault. The instance that you just referred to happened in Berdansk, which is a major town, over 100,000 people, in Zaporizhzhia Oblast on the way to Mariupol. The Russian troops entered this city over the weekend. And this morning, they were met with a large crowd of local civilians who were not really welcoming these individuals and were asking the Russian soldiers to leave the town as soon as possible. And that shows you the level of determination of unarmed Ukrainians who are willing to face armed Russian soldiers and tell them that they are not really welcome in this region. And it's important because, remember, the pretext of the Russian invasion is the claim of liberation of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. And clearly, those cities that are being attacked, those are Russian-speaking cities, and people show that they do not want to see Russians on their territory.
And Sergiy, let's talk a little bit about what happened at the UN today. There was a minute of silence. The Ukrainian ambassador spoke as well. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The Russian army shelled with Grad multiple rocket launcher systems the residential areas of the city of Kharkiv, the second biggest in Ukraine. Innocent civilians have been killed and wounded. We have been prompted to call for an emergency special session as the level of the threat to the global security has been equated to that of the Second World War, or even higher, following Putin's order to put and alert Russian nuclear forces. What a madness.
Some strong words from him. Also, we're seeing developments with these talks in Belarus. They've agreed to meet again. I want to get your thoughts on what he had to say. And do you see perhaps an opening in these talks, or are you holding out hope there? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, unfortunately, the person who leads these talks, the Russian delegation, is led by Mr. Medinsky. And Medinsky is a prominent figure who was born in Ukraine, but he is famous for publishing a series of books that denigrate Ukraine, that present Ukraine as unreliable, untruthful individuals, a nation that aligned with the West and betrayed Russia. So Putin probably has this peculiar sense of humor. For the talks with the Ukrainian delegation, he appoints an individual who is known to be ridiculing Ukrainians in his public pronouncements. So certainly that's, for me, is a very bad indication. It's an indication that Putin is not really serious about the diplomatic talks.
Anton, let me ask you about Putin's statement, talking about this nuclear threat in a way. The Washington Post this morning, the headline above the fold, Russian nuclear forces on alert. Let's listen to what President Putin actually had to say about this.
Top officials in leading NATO countries have allowed themselves to make aggressive comments about our country. Therefore, I hereby order the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff to place the Russian Army Deterrence Force on combat alert.
So, Anton, what do you make of these comments?
Well, this is more escalatory rhetoric, which only adds to the enormous amount of pressure which already exists in this situation. I did not consider this to be a direct nuclear threat to the West unless it itself attacks. I mean, the whole point is deterrence, but this certainly does not help the situation, which is already fraught. With the bigger picture, my question is still, what exactly is Putin's strategy? I don't see a clean and tidy way to climb down out of this for him without losing face. And it looks like the Ukrainians are not in a particular hurry to rush to the negotiating table, as the experience of the past 24 hours showed, where the Russian delegation, under the leadership of Medinsky, Sergiy just mentioned, had to wait for a whole night for the Ukrainians to arrive. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the next few days, and I just hope that the Russians don't change their approach to taking Ukrainian cities to storming them, because that will be a bloodbath, and it will be completely inexcusable.
Klaus, according to the Federation of American Scientists, Russia has a total nuclear warhead inventory of close to 6,000. That's the largest arsenal in the world. Naturally, Europe has jitters about this. Let's listen to Jens Stoltenberg, what he had to say with NATO.
This is dangerous rhetoric. This is a behavior which is irresponsible. And of course, if you combine this rhetoric with what they are doing on the ground in Ukraine, waging war against the independent sovereign nation, conducting full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, this adds to the seriousness of the situation. And that's the reason why we both provide support to Ukraine, but also why we over the last weeks and months have significantly increased the presence of NATO in the eastern part of the alliance. US, but also European allies are now stepping up with more troops, more ships, more planes, and why we also have to realize that we are now faced with a new normal for our security.
So, Klaus, what do you make of what he had to say?
Yeah, I think he's totally right. What Putin is doing is a dangerous game. We don't know how serious he is. Would he really employ nuclear weapons, or does he just pretend to have gone mad? That's a madman theory of history. And when you listen to the Western media, a lot of people are now coming out saying Putin has lost his mind, he has gone crazy. And Putin obviously wants to impress everyone with that idea that he may, in the last resort, use the nuclear weapon. He wants obviously to get advantages from Ukraine, from the Western world, in order to really occupy and conquer Ukraine. We don't know how serious he would be, but to utter such a threat should always be condemned by anyone who ever does so.
And Klaus, French President Emmanuel Macron was on the phone with Putin today for about an hour and a half. He also talked to the president of Ukraine after that. Can he play a role here? I know he tried to go and actually try and put the brakes on this prior to what happened. Is he in a position to actually move things forward, do you think?
I mean, a mediator is always good, always makes sense, and Macron is doing his best. He has done his best already before the crisis, but he didn't have much success. So I must say I'm very pessimistic that Macron can achieve anything. It looks as if Putin was simply stringing him along by promising things or indicating at things which seem to be indicate a softening of the Russian position. But in the end, he never really follows through. You know, he told Macron a few days or a week ago that he was not invading, and of course a few days later he did invade, and he invaded on a full scale, not just a partial part of Ukraine. but he embarked on a full invasion. So I'm very skeptical, unfortunately, regarding the role of Macron. But it would be good if we had a mediator. Maybe, you know, the Turkish president can serve as a mediator. Even China could serve as a mediator, or perhaps Israel. It would be good if some figure like that came forward. But so far, I can't see that that is happening, unfortunately.
Anton, I saw you nodding your head there. I mean, who do you see providing this role right now?
Mike, that's impossible to say. I think that the direct talks are just as well. It could be Erdogan, it could be Macron, although Putin's already sort of concluded that the Europeans don't have much of an influence on Kiev. Let me just comment quickly on what Klaus said, most of which I agree with. Macron and Scholz were shuttling between Moscow and Kiev before this disaster started in an attempt to essentially not force but convince Zelensky to budge on the Minsk II agreement. So I don't believe that Putin from the get-go had the idea of invading and carving up Ukraine or whatever it is that he plans to do. But the recognition of the two breakaway republics, which, by the way, the Russians had not done for 8 straight years during this crisis, says that they were hoping on some kind of Minsk deal. But once Putin concluded that that was simply unrealistic any longer, that's when he moved. As for the mediation, I think that the Russians may as well just speak to the Ukrainians directly, because ultimately it will have to be the West that will bring its weight onto the table here. And so far, there's just minimal contact.
Sergey, let's talk about these tough economic sanctions and this move to a certain number of Russian banks are going to be removed from SWIFT. A lot of us didn't even know what SWIFT was a few weeks ago, but it's basically this messaging service between all these international institutions, and removing these banks is really going to cripple them in many respects. What kind of pressure is this going to produce on Russia, do you think?
Well, Vladimir Putin met with his finance minister, the head of the National Bank, prime minister this morning, and they were all reporting that they're prepared to face these sanctions. They were saying that they have their own internal payment system that they can use instead of SWIFT, that they have sufficient reserves, currency reserves, in order to prevent further depreciation of the Russian currency, which, by the way, today depreciated by about 25%, and that was one of the historic drops of the Russian currency in terms of its value. So on the public, they're making statements that would seem like they are prepared for a significant hit, and that it also shows that they have been planning this move for quite some time. But on the other hand, we understand that further sanctions may be coming up, and these sanctions related to, for example, the freezing of the gold reserves of Russia that are held in European banks or American banks, so that Russia cannot really access their currency anymore and cannot use it to prop up its own national currency, or limitations on further purchase of energy supplies by the European countries. All of these sanctions will certainly have a more significant long-term effect in the future. Russia may be able to sustain itself for a few months, but we already see that the Russian public really does not trust all of these public promises of the government, because we see huge lines at the ATM machines. People are trying to take as much money as possible from their bank accounts. And that really is reminiscent of the run on the banks that happened in 1998 that led to a massive economic crisis in Russia. So all of these things are still possible in the near future. What also is happening, I think, in addition to economic pressure, is the reputational pressure on Russia. You see that Russian sports federations are kicked out of various international events. Russian national teams are no longer welcome, for example, in soccer tournaments. Russian museums lose contracts with their foreign partners. So there is this very comprehensive strategy of trying to isolate Russia in multiple sectors, not just in the economic.
Hey, Anton, I want to ask you about this because you know a great deal about the country. They've been dealing with sanctions, though, for some time. I mean, dating back to '74, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment targeted Russia, and then, of course, the Magnitsky Act in 2012. So Russia's kind of absorbed a lot of these shocks in the past. But as he pointed out, you know, the ruble seems to be cratering. The stock market closed. We're seeing escalation in interest rates. Is it different this time around?
It is different. And Sergiy pointed to all of the right factors that I would summarize with a simpler term, which is systemic. These sanctions are systemic. Neither the Jackson-Vanik Amendment nor the Magnitsky Act, which targeted individuals, neither of those targeted whole sectors of the economy, especially, of course, the finances, which end up trickling down to every single human being. So the pressure is enormous. Now, it is true that the Russians have been preparing for this. It is true that they have reserves, including about 643 billion. But in a country of 145 odd million, that kind of money will disappear fairly quickly. Can they last for a few weeks, maybe months? Yes. But then the government is going to have to explain to the Russian population why they are seeing the return of the 1990s, essentially, economically, out of which Vladimir Putin has very successfully, up until this, argued that he had sort of brought Russia into globalized and reasonably comfortable economic and financial present. And that's going to be very difficult for his government to sell to the population, which means that it's in Putin's, the Kremlin's best interest to bring this crisis to as swift a close as possible, and to get as many concessions out of Ukraine and the West, or Ukraine or the West, as possible. But I don't see a simple solution to this yet.
But to your point earlier, is he getting backed into a corner? I mean, you mentioned saving face. It gets more and more difficult, doesn't it?
It does get more and more difficult, and this is a circle that he's going to have to square, really. The Russian side released the details of the conversation with Macron today. Putin asked for the recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, for the demilitarization, denazification of the Ukrainian government. And then the third point was Ukraine's neutral status. The second and third points don't seem to have changed from what we've heard before. The Crimea is a new addition. I don't remember that specifically being mentioned within the past 3 months. And strangely, Donbass is missing from this. Whether this is a shift of focus may be, but it's way too early to tell because there are so many moving parts.
Yeah, and joining us now is Max Blumenthal. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone, an independent news website. Max, let me talk to you a little bit. We mentioned earlier that the Ukrainian ambassador spoke at the UN. We also heard from the Russian ambassador. I want to play some sound from him, and I want to get your reaction on the other side. Let's listen.
The Russian army does not pose a threat to the civilians of Ukraine, is not shelling civilian areas and cities where Russian armed forces have taken control, and these areas are seeing citizens living their lives normally. The threat to the residents of Ukraine presently is posed by the Ukrainian nationalists, who have effectively taken hostage the residents of Ukraine, and they are using them. They're hiding themselves behind them and using them as human shields. The Russian Federation did not begin these hostilities. The hostilities were unleashed by Ukraine against its own residents, the residents of Donbass, and all of those who are dissenters. Russia is seeking to end this war.
Max, he also echoed these comments when he met with reporters later, and he also talked about how Ukraine has not lived up to the Minsk II agreement, which was signed in 2015. I want to get your thoughts on what he had to say.
Well, I can tell you that at the Gray Zone, we've been covering this conflict, and I've been covering this conflict as a journalist, an independent journalist, in a way that stands in total contrast to the entire U.S. media and I guess the entire Western media, in that we've been trying to provide the context for understanding how this could develop into a much wider conflict. And that means, first of all, telling the story of how the U.S. government engineered essentially a color revolution, and after Viktor Yanukovych agreed to stand his security forces down, ultranationalist militants attempted a coup. This is back in 2014. Then Poroshenko, one of the first leaders of the one of the leaders of the Maidan regime that was brought in under U.S. stewardship, saying that Minsk was essentially a scheme to buy time for the Ukrainian military around the Donbass. The attacks on the people of Donbass, where according to the UN, over 80% of those killed since 2017 have been on the majority Russian-speaking side, and that's over 13,000 killed. And then the fact that the Ukrainian government, whether it's Vladimir Zelensky or Poroshenko or any of these figures that have been dependent on IMF loans and U.S. military support, have relied internally on the street muscle and the military muscle and ideological zeal of ultra-nationalist and even fascistic forces like the Azov Battalion, who indeed are Nazi-esque in their political tendencies. Or we could talk about C-14, which is named for the famous 14 words of white nationalist movement, which maintains enormous power in Kiev. Or we can talk about the National Corps of the Azov Battalion, which was incorporated into the National Guard, which maintains forces inside Kiev and has been able to intimidate common citizens, attack LGBT parades. All of these forces have created this toxic cocktail that have helped lead us to where we are today. But all we hear about in the U.S. is Vladimir Putin as a Bond villain, a madman who simply wants to recreate the Soviet Union, despite in his speech explaining his motives for the incursion in Ukraine, actually attacking the legacy of Lenin. All of this is left out, and anyone who says otherwise, who dissents, is labeled a traitor.
Max, I hate to cut you off, but we're running out of time, and I do want to give Sergey a chance to respond to what you just said. Sergey?
Yes, this is not a war against the Nazis. This is the war against the Ukrainian people. And most of the regions that are being attacked by Russia
those people who have SS badges or uniforms in the Azov Battalion that were made part of the National Guard. And that's completely left out of the discussion.
Okay, Max, but can you let Sergey, I gave you some time to talk. Can you let Sergey just respond quickly?
If Putin really wanted to destroy Nazis in Ukraine, a few surgical strikes on their bases would have been enough, but that's not the type of operation he is waging. He is waging an operation to capture the entire territory of Ukraine and create a puppet government, a puppet regime, so that part of Ukraine will be dismembered and destroyed as an independent state. That's what this war is all about.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. That's this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.